already guess, especially if you've seen the crash course videos, my view of these two revolutions is very, very different from John Green's. But perhaps not as different as you might think. Let's pray. Father in heaven, thank you for your blessing upon our lives. Thank you for your greatness and your kindness to us. Father, we pray that you would help us during this time of studying the American and French revolutions to understand your truth, to have wisdom and insight and discernment into these things, and that we would be faithful to you in what we learn and how we learn it and how we use it in our lives. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, well, the American and French revolutions. We're going to go with blue because blue is a color common to both of these two French revolutions. In fact, they're both the red, white, and blue. And as different as the two revolutions are, as much as we can contrast them, they still do have a whole lot in common with each other. In fact, the French helped us with our revolution. We would not have been successful in the American Revolution were it not for the French help. Now, ironically, it was the French royalist help. It was King Louis XVI. And it was, the Ancien Regime, the old order, France, that helped us with our revolution, mostly because they hated the English and they wanted to get power over the English. But the French helped us. They financed, they provided the navy, they were essential to our successful revolution in the 1770s and 1780s. And then within 6 years of the end, the official Treaty of Paris, 1783, that ended the American Revolution. It's even the Treaty of Paris because it was negotiated and signed in Paris. And 6 years later, the French Revolution begins. So they're close in time and they're connected. And some of the drivers behind the American Revolution went over to France to be involved in the French Revolution. Most notably, Thomas Paine, author of Common Sense, was one of the leading voices behind the American Revolution, and he went to the other side of the Atlantic and joined the French Revolution. But actually, Thomas Paine is an interesting guy to think about because he, in many ways, represents the difference between the American Revolution and the French Revolution, and why he was much more of a fit for the French Revolution, because Thomas Paine was much more of a radical, much more of a revolutionary rather than a reformer, and we'll get into the difference between those two things. He was also much more anti-religion, anti-supernatural revelation. So another famous work that he wrote while in France is called The Age of Reason, which is anti-supernatural religion and pro-reason and naturalism. Phone was ringing. Okay, so we're going to dig into this. We're going to start by looking at the American and French revolutions and considering some of their similarities and differences. And then we're going to dig into why the differences, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the specific events of the American Revolution and the French Revolution. This is one where the next video test is going to have more essay questions. So this is one where you need to be paying attention to big picture things, and an essay question might be compare and contrast the American and French revolutions and explain why they were both similar and yet so different from each other. So that's a pretty big hint as to what might be coming on your next video test, right? All right, similarities. Now we could be superficial and say one of the similarities is that they both have red, white, and blue for their colors. But there's some reasoning behind that. Part of the reason why the American Revolution has red, white, and blue is because the British Union Jack has red, white, and blue. So that was sort of the color that they had identified with for a long time. But some of the symbolism's the same in terms of red representing the sacrifice, the fraternity, the brotherhood, the brothers in arms, right? And the white being I think liberty, and the blue being equality. That's the French understanding, and some of those same ideals, the same ideals of the equality of men. As much as John Green harped on the differences there, there's much more similarity, okay? John Green in his videos, he sure did make it seem like it was only the Americans who were sexist and racist, and the French really were just embracing full equality. But in point of fact, there's very little difference between what the French Revolution embraced and what the American Revolution embraced in terms of their understanding of equality as it worked itself out in practice, okay? Now, the French Revolution did proclaim an end to slavery in 1794, but that did not last. 10 years later, by 1804, Napoleon has reinstituted slavery, and in point of fact, during those 10 years that it was supposedly outlawed, it continued on completely unchallenged, because while they made a proclamation, they never had the means or the will to really enforce it. And so slavery was not abolished in the French colonies, which is where it was being practiced in the French Caribbean. During the French Revolution, slavery continued to be a major driver of French economic activity coming from the French Caribbean all the way up until 1848. So you can't look at the French Revolutionary period and say it was about freeing the slaves, because it didn't. Nor was it about votes for women, because even though there's a famous Women's March, women didn't get the vote in France until much, much later. And so it's not that different on the equality front, as much as John Green tries to make it seem like it was radically different. The truth is a little bit more complicated, as he likes to say, and that is, while they made proclamations about slavery, they were not actually enforced or carried out. Thomas Jefferson's first draft of the Declaration of Independence also had anti-slavery rhetoric, and on the floor of the Continental Congress, there was intense debate about slavery and whether slavery was in keeping or in contradiction to this new republic. So it's not like the American colonies and the American revolutionaries were just completely ignorant of the whole slavery thing, like completely blind to it. And it's not like the French were really setting free slaves. At the end of the day, they were both had some anti-slavery rhetoric, but they both failed to outlaw slavery. They both came up with a constitution that includes a Bill of Rights. They both went from a system of king and parliament to a system of that king and parliament fighting against the people. So it happened in stages in the French Revolution. It happened more openly in the American Revolution, but that's basically what happens, is you end up with a revolution that pits the king and his parliament against the people in this battle. And so they have many, many similarities. But the differences is, yeah, that's good English right there. The differences are that the American Revolution aimed for a reform based on established English principles of law and rights, whereas the French were aiming for radical revolution that was aiming to overturn established French principles. So in general, if you had asked an American, do you like the British tradition, the English tradition of common law, of civil rights, they would say, yes, I am in favor of those things that are established within the English Bill of Rights, within the English traditional system of government. We just don't feel like those things are being fairly applied to us. So we want reform so that the principles that we all agree on and have had in place for some time would be fairly applied to all. The French, if you would ask them, do you like the French traditions and the French establishments, they would say no, all of it needs to go. The church, the state, it all needs to go. So the American Revolution was largely a reasonable and reasoned movement that was unified, that was involved in discourse and debate and proclamation and declaration with reasoning behind it, right? It was largely unified, and it was largely successful. We got rid of the king. We've had a government without a king, without any royalty or nobility for 230 plus years. The French Revolution was largely chaotic. It was intensely divided, it was bloody, and it was unsuccessful. At the end of the day, you had Napoleon rise to power, a stronger autocrat, a stronger dictator, a stronger monarch than King Louis XVI had been at the end of the French Revolution. Now, you could say the French Revolution doesn't really end until after Napoleon is removed, but after Napoleon is removed, it's king after king after king after king until 1888. So 101 years after we have a constitution, France finally finishes their revolution and ends up with a government that doesn't have a monarchy. All right, so moving on from similarities and differences to talking about why these differences. And John Green hints at this, and he actually does a fairly good job of scratching the surface, but not really of going all that deep with it. And the reason why, but he's got little 10-minute videos. How can you go deep in a 10-minute video, right? The difference really between the rather moderate and somewhat reform-oriented American Revolution and the much more radical French Revolution has to do with the different enlightenments that each culture had experienced. The British Enlightenment is different from the French Enlightenment. Now, they're both celebratory of human reason. They both believe that human reason and evidence and rationality, empiricism, rationalism, that these things can help you improve society and achieve better things. So they're both humanistic in that sense, and they're both rationalistic in that sense, but within the larger framework of both being Enlightenment, humanistic, rationalistic, there's a very, very different flavor to the Enlightenment that springs up in France versus the Enlightenment that springs up in England. And generally speaking, the Enlightenment that springs up in England is more moderate, is more aimed at reforming institutions rather than destroying them. It's generally focused on honoring God and acknowledging God, and it is not super confident about human nature. In fact, it is pretty negative on human nature. Okay? Whereas the radical French Enlightenment wanted to destroy the established institutions, was generally very skeptical of all faith and religion, and glorified human nature and the natural state of man. So this big difference between these two enlightenments shows itself later in the big difference in the revolutions. These differences can be seen in a couple of key exemplary thinkers of the two enlightenments. Probably the chief political thinker of the British Enlightenment was John Locke, and certainly his influence on Thomas Jefferson is undeniable. And here are two things John Locke is famous for saying. All mankind being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. This gets adapted, and God is re-brought back into the picture in the Declaration of Independence, where we say all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But the idea is a Lockean idea that is made more theistic. It's made more God-oriented in the Declaration of Independence than it is in John Locke, who is more of a secularist. And John Locke also says government has no other end but the preservation of property, right? So there's no other purpose for government but the preservation of property. And this is Locke's idea that is also behind the American Revolution, and that's different in the French Revolution. In the French Revolution, they had no problem with taking property from people. Now a large part of this, okay, so this isn't really in my slides, and I don't think I'm going to ask you this, although if you remember it and write it down, you'll get like a better essay grade, right? So a large part of the reason behind this is that the English, in a sense, the English had already had their big revolution in what's called the English Civil War. the English Civil War, which happens in the 1640s to the 1660s, so 100 years before the 7 Years' War, and over 100 years before the American Revolution, there is this English Civil War. And in the English Civil War, which, by the way, the Westminster Confession of Faith, which we have, comes from 1643, it comes out of the English Civil War. What was it? It was a war between Parliament and the king. Parliament waged war on the king, deposed the king, beheaded the king as a traitor to the people, and then instituted a constitutional government without a king for a period of time, although Oliver Cromwell functioned kind of like a Napoleon figure. He was the Lord Protectorate of England. And then his son was there, and he wasn't very popular, and he was overthrown. And then the monarchy was reestablished. But the monarchy was reestablished by the English Parliament. So does that sound familiar? I mean, it's kind of similar to what happens in the French Revolution. And it's something that is overlooked in a lot of history, including John Green's own history. It doesn't talk about the English Civil War. The English Civil War is, in a sense, England's true revolution. So by the time the American Revolution happens in the 1770s, there's already 110, 120, 130 years of tradition that they're building on, where the king doesn't have absolute power over the people. Taxation is very much under the control of the Parliament. There's very much a limited constitutional monarchy, and so they feel like their rights are being violated, and that's really important. Okay, so these three thinkers that you can contrast with each other are an interesting study in how the Enlightenment progresses and how it differs from England to France. So you have three guys. Thomas Hobbes, he's the sour-faced looking bald guy at the top. He has the most negative view of human nature. People are inherently evil and need to be protected from themselves with a parliament, with a government, right? Basic human rights, there are natural rights so far as they are necessary for survival. A social contract is that people have to give up some of their rights in order for government to protect them and to provide them with order. Okay? And then the role of the state is to prevent chaos. Religion has to be unified because you have to have a unified religion. And then the best type of government is then a monarchy. Right? So that's Thomas Hobbes. And there's still some Hobbesian influence even in the thinking of the American Revolution. But in reality, the thinking of the American Revolution is much more influenced by John Locke. And John Locke believes that people are basically good, but that they're corrupted by society. So this would be the view of Thomas Jefferson, but not the view of people like Alexander Hamilton or even James Madison, who had a much more negative view of human nature, and at least at the time of the Revolution, had a much more Christian view of human nature. James Madison's views change later. He becomes more secular by the time he becomes president. But that's a story for another day. Okay, so Locke's ideas are really the ideas of the Jeffersonian Revolution, the Declaration of Independence. Okay, so all people are equal. They have the right to basic life, liberty, and property. Government offers services and protection for the people. And the people have the right to change the government if the government does not serve the people. You see, under Hobbes, you'd be very slow and reluctant to overthrow the government because without the government, you're going to have a state of chaos. But with Locke, people are already basically good, and so if the government's not doing a good job at what it's supposed to do, it should be changed. And the government's job, this is key, that center box on this chart is key. The state's purpose is to protect a person's natural rights. So you see that John Locke lived long before the American Revolution. He died in 1704. But the Americans could say in the Declaration of Independence, hey guys, you were supposed to protect our rights. And instead of protecting our rights, you violated our rights and took our rights. Therefore, we have the right to change our government. So it's a very Lockean document, the Declaration of Independence is. He believes in religious toleration, which is something that had taken hold in England by the 1700s. It had not taken hold in France, which was a key difference. And he believed in a representative government that would be, a republic, basically. A constitutional monarchy would be good, but it really needs to, the strength of the country, the government, the lawmaking needs to be done by a representative body, for sure, under John Locke's idea. And then you see Jean-Jacques Rousseau in the third column. He's the French guy, right? Life is purest in nature, and civilized man is corrupted, right? And unequal. So he glorifies, he goes from not just affirming, but he glorifies the natural state of man. And so he wants a minimalist government that doesn't just protect people's rights, but it serves the general will. It does whatever the people want it to do. This is more pure democracy. And this is more the idea that people have today about government and why it's dangerous that we are developing these ideas, because Rousseau's ideas are failures when they're actually tried out in the real world. Exhibit A is the French Revolution and 19,000 heads rolling in the Reign of Terror, okay? And he doesn't like religion. He kind of pays lip service to God, as long as what you mean by God is the one who made me good and leaves me alone to do whatever I want. If that's what you mean by God, the one who makes me good and then leaves me alone to do whatever I want, then I like that kind of God. By the way, Rousseau was a horrible individual. He fathered 5 children out of wedlock, dropped them all off on the doorsteps of orphanages, which were nightmare institutions back in Rousseau's day, claimed no responsibility for them, took no care of them. He was a very immoral person, whereas both Locke and Hobbes were basically upstanding moral people. And that is perhaps a huge difference as well, and that is that there is a strong moral sense undergirding the English Enlightenment, whereas there is sort of a libertine or anti-traditional morality sense that undergirds the English Enlightenment. So why was the English Enlightenment more moderate? So it's one thing to say the American Revolution is more moderate because the English Enlightenment was more moderate, but we have to back up and ask the question, why was the English Enlightenment more moderate? Well, you find a reason for it in the state, I believe, and you also find a reason for it in the church. In France, you had absolute monarchy, so the belief was, God made me king, and I have been given the right by God to do whatever I want. That is absolute monarchy. God has made me king. Not only that, but because God has made me king, I can do whatever I want, and you can't stop me because God made me king. That's a very twisted version of a Romans 13 understanding of God-ordained government. Whereas in England, as far back as 1215, really as far back as when you had kings, you always had kings whose authority was limited by written documents and also by agreements. And 2 of the really key written documents that limited the rights of the king were the Magna Carta in 1215, which gave rights to the nobility in England. So Magna Carta really is all about nobles getting rights. But what happens later with the English Bill of Rights in 1689, 100 years before the French Revolution, the English Bill of Rights gives rights to the people. It separates powers between the monarch and the parliament. It limits the powers of the king and queen. It enhances democratic elections, and it strengthens freedom of speech. This English Bill of Rights is what American colonists claimed applied to them and was being denied them. And this is very important for understanding the American Revolution rightly. Okay? But you also had, in the church, you had a Reformed Protestant church. It wasn't fully Reformed, it wasn't exactly Presbyterian, but it was more Reformed, more Protestant than the Catholic Church in France, which was still very wealthy, very corrupt, very detached from the people. The Reformation came to France, and the king and the Catholic Church executed it. The slaughter of the Huguenots on St. Bartholomew's Day, when somewhere between 30,000 and 100,000 French Protestants were killed and the rest fled the country and went to Holland or England, drove the Protestant Reformation out of France. But the Protestant Reformation was not driven out of England. There was an attempt to do so under Bloody Queen Mary, but she failed. And when her half-sister, Queen Elizabeth, took over, the 39 Articles, which were basically a Reformation document, were passed by Parliament in 1571 and accepted as the official religion of the land. Now, what's different about Protestantism is not just that it's Protestant versus Catholic, but there is more of an ideal placed on being able to read and write and think for yourself, and also having personal knowledge and piety. So the Bible had been translated into English, and in English it had been placed in every church in England, and then the people were taught how to read so that they could read the Bible for themselves. And so there's this ideal of education, but there's also an ideal within religion of being able to think for yourself to a certain extent. It's not like they had radical freedom of religion, although by the 1700s they had much more freedom of religion in England than they had in France. So all of this is what lies underneath the huge contrast between the American Revolution and the French Revolution. The American Revolution didn't need to be as radical because many of the things that the French were fighting for, the English already had. And they had already had them for like 100 years. So don't let John Green make you think that, oh, the English were so backwards and the English were so traditionalist. Many of the things the French were fighting for, the English had already fought for and had already received 100 years prior. And so all the American colonists were trying to do was to say, yes, those are our rights too. You can't deny us the same rights that everybody in England has. It's not like by coming over the ocean to this new land, we suddenly lost all of our rights, right? So they said, just because we're over here and you're over there doesn't mean we lose the right to representation in our taxation. It doesn't mean we lose the right to a participatory government. We don't become slaves because we're on the other side of a large body of water from you. So the real difference is the difference between reform and revolution. This is important, knowing the difference between what is reformation and what is revolution. Reformation is a call to return to ideals that are already held and that are already espoused. So if you are trying to reform something, you are trying to correct errors that have come in, get rid of corruption that has crept in, get rid of oppression that has come in, and you are trying to return to something that at one time everybody agreed on. This is why the Protestant Reformation is a reformation, because Martin Luther read the Bible in Greek, in the original, and he said, hey, let's go back to this. He wasn't trying to come up with something new. He was trying to say, let's go back to what we all at one time agreed on before things got so corrupt. A revolution is different. A revolution is about smashing and destroying. It's about overthrowing. It's about tearing down and coming up with something new. And that is a point that John Green has missed. And in this sense, yes, the American Revolution is less revolutionary than the French Revolution. It is. But that's probably because it didn't have to be as revolutionary, because in 1770, England already had a much more constitutional government than France. All right, now the beginning of the American Revolution. From here on out, we're going to talk about the American Revolution, and then we're going to talk about the French Revolution. The beginning of the American Revolution is a beginning that John Green misses in his video. He goes from 7 Years' War immediately to the Stamp Act, and this is what he says. He says, Great Britain won all this land. We won all this land for the colonists, and so we're going to ask the colonists to pay for the land through this little Stamp Act. How reasonable of Parliament, how ridiculous of the colonists to object. It's sort of what he says. He doesn't say it exactly that way. But he says in his video that England won and that they won land for the colonists. If that were true, we may not have had an American Revolution. But like many of the things John Green says, it's not true. Because just a couple of months after the end of the 7 Years' War, you have the Royal Proclamation of 1763, and the map on your screen shows you the proclamation line. Everything in the lighter pink is land that was won from the French in the 7 Years' War, and it was land that the king, by royal proclamation, closed off to American settlement. He said, here's the line. All this new territory that you fought for, that you died for, you can't settle. Well, if you're an American now, you fought for land that you're not allowed to live in, and now you're going to be asked to pay for the war that secured that land that you're not allowed to live in. This is the beginning that John Green misses, and by missing it, he misses the whole point. He does get one thing right. The issue with the Americans and their objection to the British was never about the amount of the tax. It was about taxation without representation. There were a series of acts that the British Parliament passed. 1764 was actually the beginning, when they taxed sugar. 1765 was the most obnoxious one because sugar is something that you use somewhat, but it's not absolutely essential to life, and you can skip it if you don't really want to use it. I mean, it was kind of a delicacy back then anyway, and so if you decided, I'm going to live without sugar, guess what? You can live without sugar. I'm on day 29 of 30 days of living without sugar. And really, since December 1st, I've had very limited amounts of sugar in my diet. But the last 29 days, I haven't had sugar. You can live without sugar. What you can't live without is legal documents. And the Stamp Act of 1765 said, any legal document, anything printed on paper, a sales contract, a house mortgage, a bill of sale from purchasing something, cards, stationery, anything printed on paper had to be stamped and taxed. So this was unavoidable and was imposed without representation. So this was the act which, in conjunction with the Royal Proclamation of 1763, leads to the Americans uniting and rebelling. We're going to boycott, and we're going to communicate and coordinate our boycott with each other. Also in 1765, along with the Stamp Act, was the Quartering Act. This was an act that said, if Britain wants to put soldiers in your house, you have to house them and feed them and clothe them and take care of them for a certain period of time. It couldn't be open-ended, but still you had to let soldiers into your home and you had to feed them and clothe them. And in many cases, you viewed these soldiers as the ones who were there in order to impose these taxes on you that you didn't want. So you didn't want to pay the Stamp Act tax, but now not only do you have to pay the Stamp Act tax, but you have to pay to house the guy who's there to enforce your paying of the Stamp Act tax that you don't want to pay. This is not a good way to make people happy. The Stamp Act was repealed, but then Parliament said, we're going to tax glass, lead, paints, paper, and tea. So instead of just one thing, paper, we're going to do glass, lead, paints, paper, and tea. And those are called the Townshend Acts. Those would lead to the Boston Massacre and the Boston Tea Party. Boston was the wealthiest city in America. It was the busiest port in America. That's why it was a center for revolutionary activities, because there was a lot of wealth and there was a lot of trade. It's where the imports and exports were coming in and out, see? And so there is where the Boston Tea Party happens in 1774, right? And the 1773, sorry, and the Boston Massacre before in 1770. By the way, another little aside about how annoying John Green can be sometimes. He makes light of the Boston Massacre by saying only 5 people were killed. Well, in 1970, in protests of the Vietnam War, 1970, in protest of the Vietnam War, there was something called the Kent State Massacre. Now, some people just call it the Kent State shooting, but I bet you John Green calls it the Kent State Massacre. And 4 students were killed at Kent State. But it was still a massacre because armed troops, fired on unarmed students. And much of the same reason was given in both cases. The unarmed crowd had rocks or stones or whatever and was throwing them at the soldiers and provoking them. So if you're going to call one a massacre, you've got to be okay with calling the other one a massacre. The Boston Tea Party happens in 1773, and then the shot heard round the world, Lexington and Concord. The actual beginning of the War for Independence happens in 1775. Now here's an area where I do agree with John Green, and that is when he says it's not like the American Revolution and the War for Independence are one thing. It's not like you can take American Revolution and War for Independence and overlap them and say those are just 2 names for the same thing. No, the American Revolution really does begin with the Stamp Act Congress, the response to the Stamp Act, where they said taxation without representation it's a violation of our civil rights and not something we're going to stand for. When the American colonists begin these committees of correspondence and begin objecting and boycotting, that's the beginning of the American Revolution. It's going to take 9 years for that to break out into open warfare. And very soon after it breaks out into open warfare, Thomas Jefferson writes and Congress edits the Declaration of Independence in 1776. So 1774 to 1776 is when the overlap happens between American Revolution and War for Independence. But then after that, the War for Independence, the revolution's already happened. Once the Declaration of Independence is signed by representatives from all 13 colonies, the revolution is over. It's been done. Now it's a matter of whether or not we're going to survive and become independent. That's why it's a war for independence after 1776. So that little diagram he showed on the video is exactly right. I agree with that one wholeheartedly. He gets it right. Okay, so what are these committees of correspondence I referred to? The committees of correspondence was something to help coordinate and enforce the boycotts. So we don't want to pay the British tax, so we're going to boycott British goods. Well, how are you going to coordinate that? How do you know where to buy the black market goods that are not being taxed instead of buying the ones that are being taxed? How do you enforce that? How do you find out who's cheating and who's buying anyway? Well, committees of correspondence were kind of like spy networks who did this, and so they kind of were a hybrid between a pseudo-government or a shadow government because they were making policy and enforcing it, and a spy network because really what they were doing was spying on their neighbors and getting them to not participate in the purchase of British taxed goods. So was the American Revolution revolutionary? Yes, and this is also where I think John Green gets it pretty much right. Yes, the American Revolution was revolutionary in that it did successfully overthrow the monarchy and lead to the establishment of a republic, which was a country governed by a constitutional government with no royalty or nobility. There were precious few of these in the world at the time. The Netherlands was one, and Switzerland was one. By the way, both strongly Reformed Protestant cultures. So where the Reformation spread the most strongly, especially in its Calvinistic form, you had republics. But no, it wasn't that revolutionary, because what it was doing was affirming much of what was already established in British law and constitution. The American colonists just wanted their rights as British citizens recognized and respected. They had legislative bodies. Each colony, the colony of Maryland, the colony of Massachusetts Bay, the colony of New York, each colony had its own legislature, and its legislature was where they came up with tax bills and they paid taxes. You had to pay taxes, absolutely. But you paid the taxes that your legislature determined you had to pay, which is the same way it worked in England, only England's legislature was called Parliament. And since none of the colonies had any seats in Parliament, they could rightly say, Parliament is not our legislature, so they can't pass tax laws for us. It would be like the state of Virginia passing an income tax, a state income tax, and saying that the state of Maryland has to pay it. That's how the American colonists viewed it. This is England. We're not in England. We're in Maryland. We're in Virginia. We're in Carolina. We're in Georgia. We're in Massachusetts. We're in Delaware, right? We're not in England. So England has the English Parliament that passes taxes for England. Massachusetts has the Massachusetts General Assembly that passes taxes for Massachusetts. And Virginia has the Virginia House of Burgesses that passes taxes for Massachusetts. And just like today, we wouldn't stand for it if Pennsylvania passed an income tax bill and imposed it on Maryland. We would say, who are you to tax us? That's kind of how the American colonists viewed the English Parliament taxing them. They were British. The American colonists saw themselves as being British, but not English, because England is a country and Great Britain is a nation. England, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, right? Basic geography. So this is important to understand this mindset of why the revolution was revolutionary, but it wasn't. They did end up with a republic without a monarch, but they probably would have been happy to have a monarch if the monarch had respected for them the laws and the rights that had already been established for 100 years or more. All right, let's jump over to France. I knew this one was going to be longer than last week because they've got a lot more to cover. So, jumping over to France. Now, John Green, like a good liberal socialist, he thinks that many of the world's problems can be found in an inefficient or ineffective way of collecting taxes. Notice when he talked about the Spanish Empire and its downfall, he didn't talk about the fact that Spain never developed, like Rodney Stark talks about. He talked about the fact that Spain didn't collect enough taxes. If only Spain had collected more taxes, in John Green's world, they would have been okay. And the same thing is true in 18th century France. If only the rich had paid their fair share of taxes, then 18th century France would have been just fine, despite the fact that it was corrupt and unequal and not free. It wasn't necessarily a lack of liberty that John Green points to as the heart of the problem. It was bad tax policy. Typical liberal socialist. Okay, so it did have a tax problem. It was true that basically all the wealth in the country was held by kings and nobles and clergy never paid taxes. Now here's the truth of who did pay taxes. Who paid taxes in 18th century France were the merchants, the businessmen. So in many ways, the French Revolution in its first stage was led by businessmen, because they were the ones of the third estate who had money but not title. And so if you had money but not title, you were taxed. And in fact, you paid all the taxes. All the taxes were paid by people who had money but no title. So the merchants, the businessmen, the shopkeepers, the blacksmiths, the butchers, the candlestick makers, the bakers, the tradesmen, the shopkeepers, the shipping company owners. These people were not lords, but they had wealth, and so they paid their taxes. They were the ones who led stage one of the French Revolution. Now, France couldn't get enough taxes from these people because they were a fairly small slice of the population, They were above the penniless peasants who had no money to give for taxes, and they were below the lords and the clergy who did not have to pay taxes. And so there's only so much money you can get from a small slice of your population. And so they didn't get enough money and they had to go bankrupt. But at the same time, hailstorms destroyed that year's harvest. And so it was food shortages. In 1789, it was as much food shortages as anything else that drove the French Revolution forward. So, Enlightenment ideas were circulating around, and the Enlightenment ideas were saying, maybe the right to govern comes from the consent of the governed. Maybe it's the people who have the power and not the king. And so these ideas, when people are hungry and people want bread, the uneducated masses were kind of manipulated by the Enlightenment thinkers and by the merchants and the shopkeepers and the businessmen who had read some Enlightenment guys and who knew the right things to say, and so they kind of whipped the crowds into a frenzy, and that drove the revolution forward. The big revolutionary day in France, by the way, is Bastille Day. Now, this is actually very interesting because in June of 1789, the National Assembly breaks up. The non-nobles and non-clergy, they go over to the tennis court. They take the tennis court oath. The tennis court oath says, we vow not to separate and to reassemble wherever circumstances require until the Constitution of the kingdom is established. In other words, they created a National Assembly on June 20th of 1789. But here's the problem. Their National Assembly had no weapons, and so they needed a way to get weapons. But they needed a way to get weapons that would rally the people of the streets of Paris to support them in their effort to get weapons. And so they focused on the Bastille, which had been a symbol of French royal oppression of the people for years, and held, at the time there were only about 7 prisoners there, but they were political prisoners. They were prisoners of the king, who were not true criminals, but were in there because of their views, right? And so 4th of July in Paris is 14th of July. It's Bastille Day. They celebrate marching on the Bastille, freeing those 7 prisoners, and more importantly, seizing the weapons. And the reason why the weapons were important is because the weapons allowed the people to be armed and to carry on their revolutionary struggle against the king and the nobles and the clergy. So the declaration of it is our 4th of July is a celebration of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Ours is the celebration of a document, of a reasoned argument being put forth as to why we had the right and we're now declaring independence. The French celebration is of a mob storming a castle and stealing the weapons. It's 2 very different things to celebrate, and in that you have very much a difference between the American and the French Revolution. The French Revolution is much more mob violence, and the American Revolution is much more reasoned defense of ideas and principles of sound government and constitutional limits on governmental authority. So, July 14th is Bastille Day. Now they have weapons. Freshly armed with their weapons, they reconvene as a National Assembly, and on August 4th, they abolish the Ancien Régime. The Ancien Régime is the old order, right? The ancient regime, right? We say the old order. Feudal rights, they were still under feudalism in 1789. This is why England didn't need a revolution like this, because they got rid of feudalism a long time ago. Well, not really. But they got rid of feudal rights, they got rid of the enforced tithes, they got rid of noble privileges, and they got rid of unequal taxation. They were all abolished, and 22 days later, on August 26th, 1789, the Assembly declared the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. This is the big document that is kind of more like our Declaration of Independence, except it's more like our Bill of Rights, which didn't come along till 1791. By the way, I really do not like John Green's description of the Bill of Rights at all. It irritates me, like a lot of what he does. Anyway, next. By October, people are still hungry. People are still starving. They may have rights, but rights don't put bread on the table. And so they've heard a rumor that Marie Antoinette has grain stored up in large hoards at Versailles. Versailles is outside of Paris, quite a distance back in the day. And so there was a women's march. By the way, the women's marches that are in protest of Trump, they are deliberately modeled after this woman's march. The most effective and powerful women's march in history, October 5th, 1789. They were armed, and being armed, they march on Versailles. And see, it was very wise of them to have women, because if it was a group of men, the soldiers guarding Versailles, the king's army, would just open fire and kill them all. But women, you know, you're supposed to be a gentleman. You're not supposed to fire on women. You're not supposed to harm women. So, you know, they just sort of didn't know what to do. And so the women marched in, and they demanded that King Louis and Marie Antoinette move from Versailles to Paris, where basically they could keep a closer eye on them. And they also could search Versailles and make sure there was no grain being hoarded up. There was no grain being hoarded up, and Marie Antoinette never said let them eat cake, which also John Green is correct about. So, this first phase of the French Revolution, there is mob violence, there is an overthrow, but it's not so revolutionary because really they wanted a constitutional monarchy. For the most part, this National Assembly, they were the businessmen, they were the shopkeepers, they were not the poor peasants, not the Assembly. The Assembly, actually, they wanted voters, and elected officials to all be men of property. You had to own property to be able to vote and to be able to hold office. So these are not the poor peasants. They are leading the poor peasants in mobs, but the leadership of this first phase of the French Revolution are basically small businessmen. And so it's not that revolutionary because they want a constitutional monarchy. They do not get rid of King Louis right away. It's not until later that King Louis is caught conspiring against France. So King Louis and the National Assembly decide to invade Austria. Austria was a very wealthy country, and they thought, the National Assembly were really the ones behind it, they thought that if they could get into Austria, they could get the food and the grain, and they could finally feed the people. People are still starving, okay? And so what ended up happening is that Prussia, which is basically East Germany, right? When you hear Prussia, think East Germany. Prussia joins in Austria fighting against the French. And Louis XVI is actually encouraging the Prussians in fighting with the Austrians against the French. Why would Louis do this? Well, it's very simple. If the National Assembly loses this great war, they'll be removed from power, and he can be restored to his rightful place as the divine right king, absolute monarch. He doesn't like being sort of the puppet of the National Assembly, but he doesn't really have a choice. And so he does actually conspire against France, and in doing so is caught, put on trial, and beheaded, and the Assembly suspends the monarchy, and this drives us into the Reign of Terror, the time after the death of King Louis XVI, when a very bloody, very violent phase of the French Revolution takes place. 16,000 people are beheaded by the guillotine in different trials. You know, one faction gains power, they execute all their enemies, then the other faction gains power, they execute all their enemies. All of this finally ends up with Napoleon becoming the consul of France, just like the Roman consuls of old, of like Julius Caesar type, right? So Napoleon becomes the first consul of France, and the French Revolution ends by the imposition of a dictatorship. So it is a failure. The French Revolution is a failure, and John Green likes it. Even though he recognizes it as a failure, he likes it because he perceives it to be more radical and more liberal than the American Revolution, which was more reasoned and more moderate. But because it was more reasoned and more moderate, it was more successful. But let's not lose sight of the fact that it could be more reasoned and more moderate, because within the English Constitution and within English civil law, they already had a Bill of Rights. They already had a constitutional monarchy. They already had checks and balances. And so they didn't need to be radical. The only thing the Americans were asking for, again, was give us the rights that all British citizens are entitled to have. And Parliament refused to give them those rights, and so they said, like John Locke, if you're not going to protect our rights, we have the right to change our government. So hopefully you could write a nice essay on what's the difference between the American Revolution and the French Revolution, and why was the American Revolution less radical and more successful, and what's the difference between revolution and reform, and why is the American Revolution more of an example of reformation and not true revolution, all those kinds of things. Hopefully you can do that. Meanwhile, enjoy the ski trip for those of you who are going on the ski trip, and I will see you back here online. We have another session next week before we meet in person next Thursday. So, goodbye.